Welcome to Module 2, Session 4, a lesson on strategies for teaching science to linguistically diverse students, listening and speaking, brought to you by the University of the District of Columbia's Project FIRST and the Center for Applied Linguistics. In this session, after the warm-up, you will review Cal's Principles of Effective Instruction for English Learners, practice with language and content objectives, and then we will focus on instructional strategies for developing listening and speaking skills. We will finish with a wrap-up and then tickets out. In this session, we will model content and language objectives as an approach for planning content lessons with language development in mind. Content objectives are most closely aligned with the grade level content standards. For your content objectives today, you will be able to determine language practices needed to participate in physical and earth and space science lessons, distinguish between content and language objectives, identify strategies to build the listening and speaking skills of linguistically diverse students, and plan a physical and earth and space science lesson that includes strategies to teach science to linguistically diverse students, including objectives and assessment plans. Language objectives are how students will meet those content standards. How, through reading, writing, listening, and speaking, will you demonstrate knowledge of the grade level concepts? Today, in this session, you will be able to orally share principles of effective instruction and describe how they may look in the classroom. You will record language practices related to physical and earth and space science lessons in a graphic organizer. You will write language objectives based on content objectives, and you will read a research brief on developing science lessons infused with language practices and writing a plan using a template. Therefore, you will be speaking, writing, and reading purposefully. You will receive handout 4.A, Cal's Principles of Effective Instruction for English Learners. This is a research-based summary of appropriate instructional strategies for teaching English learners. There are 7 principles. Rather than read all 7, we will chunk the information and then share out. Chunking up a larger text is also an effective strategy for English learners or struggling readers. Count off in the room 1 through 7. This number is the number of the principle that you will read. Each person should read his or her assigned principle and then draw and label what the principle might look like when implemented in the science classroom. Note that you have a letter at the top of your page. Circle that letter. To share out what you drew about the principles of effective instruction, we will use the strategy of inside-outside circles. Notice at the top of your paper, you either have an A or a B. We will form 2 concentric circles. Our A team will be in the center with their backs facing each other. The B's will form a ring around the A's, facing one partner each. Let's have our A's bring their handouts and form the circle first, facing out. When they have formed a circle or oval, B's, please form a circle by standing in front of one of the A's. While sharing out, in this case, recall that you have read one of the 7 principles of effective instruction for English learners, and it's very likely that your partner hasn't read the same principle. Therefore, you will need to begin your discussions by sharing a summary of your principle. Then you may describe your principle by saying, I drew blank because blank. Continue your conversation a little further by discussing if the principle is or is not demonstrated in the classrooms where you work. You will have 3 minutes to discuss both of your principles. When time is called, the inside circle, the A's, will stay in place, and the outside circle, the B's, will move one person to the left and share again. Let's debrief this activity, inside-outside circles. Discuss the questions as a group. How was this activity effective for English learners? Thinking back to the principles, which principles did it align with? How did it specifically build speaking and listening skills? How could you modify this activity for science content? Turn to handout 4.C. As a review, scan the levels that we are using to define academic language at the discourse, sentence, and word or phrase level. Look at the picture. On handout 4.D, describe what language, at each of the 3 levels of the word, sentence, and discourse levels, would be appropriate to describe these pictures from both a physical and earth and space science perspective. Using handouts 4.C and 4.D, describe what language at the word, sentence, and discourse levels would be appropriate to describe this picture from both a physical and earth and space science perspective. Using handouts 4.C and 4.D, describe what language at the word, sentence, and discourse levels would be appropriate to describe this picture from both a physical and earth and space science perspective. Using handouts 4.C and 4.D, describe what language at the word, sentence, and discourse levels would be appropriate to describe this picture from both a physical and earth and space science perspective. Using handouts 4.C and 4.D, describe what language at the word, sentence, or discourse levels of language would be appropriate to describe this picture from both a physical and earth and space science perspective. Turn to handout 2.D on language objectives for more information on content and language objectives. Many schools are required to post content objectives as a method of backwards lesson design and to ensure that both teachers and students are aware of lesson targets. One approach to explicitly teaching and assessing language development in the content classroom is to also add language objectives. Just like content objectives, language objectives should be standards-based or based on English language proficiency standards. They should be measurable, action-oriented, and observable. They should be in kid-friendly language. They should be posted and discussed with the students so that students are aware of their content and language objectives for that lesson. The objectives should be related to one lesson, which may last for a day, 2 days, or even more, and they should be assessed or reviewed at the end of each lesson and part of ongoing formative assessment. Content objectives are typically drawn from state standards and the next generation science standards. It's helpful to look at the verbs used in content objectives. They are related to the knowledge of the content area or cognitive processes. You might think of them as verbs associated with Bloom's taxonomy or the depths of knowledge. Examples might include solve, create, model, design, graph, or analyze. Content objectives focus on the what. What are students going to learn and be able to do by the end of the lesson? Language objectives are typically drawn from the Common Core or English language development standards. There are many sources for language objectives, such as analyzing students' reading, writing, listening, and speaking for areas where they need to grow, or looking at the content and the language required to be successful in talking or writing about that content, the way you just did with the pictures. In DC, teachers might look at the WIDA performance indicators and can-do descriptors to get ideas of areas where English learners need help. But language objectives are for mainstream content classrooms and therefore should be tied to helping all students be able to talk about and write about grade level content concepts. Just like for content objectives, it's helpful to plan for the types of verbs needed for language objectives. Verbs related to reading, writing, listening, and speaking. Some examples are list, record, orally explain, summarize in writing, or listen and check off on a graphic organizer. The emphasis for language objectives is on how. How will students achieve the content standards through reading, writing, listening, and speaking? So if the content objectives focus on the what, the language objectives focus on the how. Take a moment and read the content and language objectives in the chart. Notice that the content and language objectives are both related to lesson content. The speech bubble gives one way to write and think about the content and language objectives, since the language objectives are how the content objectives are achieved through reading, writing, listening, and speaking. When you have read the objectives, turn to a partner and identify the verbs that help you determine if the objectives are content or language objectives. Think back to the previous session on developing reading and writing in science, where we covered content and language objectives. Discuss the questions with a partner. Turn to handout 4.E, Language Objectives Chart. Read the content objectives provided in the table. Think of a classroom activity that the students would complete to meet that objective. What language might be involved? Which language domains? Reading, writing, listening, speaking, or a combination of one or more of those language domains? In the right-hand column, write a language objective to match each content objective. You will each get a playing card. Walk out of your seat and find the partner with the same number and color as you. Share your responses to handout 4.E. Think about how you learned your first language. You learned through your relationships and interaction with family or caregivers. Language learning for both first and additional languages is social. Therefore, English learners benefit from a social and collaborative learning environment, particularly when the activity is perceived as less risky, like talking in pairs, as opposed to presenting to the entire classroom. Scaffolding, or providing temporary language support, such as through sentence stems, enables learners to increase skills and knowledge as they gain mastery of a new task. Producing language helps English language learners process language more deeply. Cooperative learning, which encourages collaboration and language output from all students, promotes higher achievement among students at all grade levels and in all subjects. Let's look at one of the anchor standards from the Common Core State Standards. The Common Core provides us with leverage for teaching speaking in the content classroom. According to the Common Core State Standards, students must be able to present information, findings, and supporting evidence that listeners can follow the line of reasoning and make sure the organization, development, and style are appropriate to task, purpose, and audience. It requires students to be able to make strategic use of digital media and visual displays of data to express information and enhance understanding of presentations. And it requires students to adapt speech to a variety of contexts and communicative tasks, demonstrating command of formal English when indicated or appropriate. Based on the articles you read by Zwires and Crawford, discuss the questions with a partner. According to Zwires and Crawford, most whole class discussions limit the amount of time each student gets to talk. There can be fear of intimidation in front of a whole group. Think, pair, shares and vocabulary games are only short bursts of talk, but unfortunately, they're the most used conversation starters in classrooms. In classroom observations, most think, pair, shares are actually quite short and shallow when analyzed. There is a need to equip students with conversational skills in the content classroom. In analyzing classroom conversations, Zwires and Crawford concluded in their 2009 article that there are 6 components to effective academic conversations. These include initiating a worthwhile topic, elaborating and clarifying, supporting one's ideas, building on or challenging another's ideas, applying ideas to life, and paraphrasing or summarizing the conversation. In their 2009 article, Zwires and Crawford aligned the 6 features of academic conversations that they identified to the analogy of building a house. The intervention that they implemented had students using gestures, pictures, and sentence or question prompts to deepen their level of conversation. The features were explicitly taught to the students one at a time, and students were given purposeful topics and times to practice each of these features. In the next few slides, we will look at a dialogue from the Zwires and Crawford 2009 article. 2 people can read the dialogue. The rest of the class should think about the features of academic conversation as identified by Zwires and Crawford that you hear. Let's have 2 participants read the roles of Juan and Ana. The rest of the class should listen and identify the features of academic conversation within this dialogue. How do Juan and Ana initiate a worthwhile topic? How do they elaborate and clarify their ideas? How do they support their own ideas? How do they build on or challenge the other's ideas? Finally, how do they apply the ideas to real life and then paraphrase or summarize before ending their conversation? Turn to a partner and discuss the questions. Then we'll share as a larger group. As you listen to the dialogue of Juan and Ana, what features of academic conversation did you notice in the conversation? How might some aspects of this strategy be adapted for a middle grades science classroom? Now let's talk about the language domain of listening. Look at the pictures. Which ones demonstrate hearing versus listening? Turn to a partner and discuss the question. This chart breaks down the difference between hearing and listening. Look at the list. Is there something you would revise based on what you discussed with your partner? The Common Core also includes standards on listening. The Common Core state standards state the students should be able to prepare for and participate effectively in a range of conversations and collaborations with diverse partners, building on others' ideas and expressing their own ideas clearly and persuasively. The Common Core requires students to integrate and evaluate information presented in diverse media and formats, including visually, qualitatively, and orally. And finally, the listening standards require students to evaluate a speaker's point of view, reasoning, and use of evidence and rhetoric. A dictogloss is an activity to purposely practice listening. Take out a piece of paper. Listen as the instructor reads a paragraph. Record as many words or phrases as you can. Now listen to the same paragraph again and try to record even more words. Next, work with a partner. Discuss your notes and try to rewrite the paragraph using your notes. Now read the paragraphs aloud. Compare your paragraph to the original. Let's debrief these questions as a class. How was the Dictogloss activity effective for English learners? Which principles did it align with? How did it build speaking and listening skills? Finally, how would you modify this activity for science content?
For the next class, the following articles are assigned to you.
Let's debrief these questions as a whole group. How does a video observation guide benefit English learners? Which principles does it align with? How does it build speaking and listening skills? And finally, how would you modify this activity for science content? Turn to handout 4.H. Information gaps are a wonderful way to explicitly target speaking and listening skills. This information gap is about biomes. Work with a partner. Decide who will be partner A and who will be partner B. Make sure you are looking only at the sheet that is assigned to you. At first glance, it may appear that you have the same charts, but notice that half of the information is false. You will need to talk to each other to determine which facts about each biome are true. For example, the person A will pick a biome and read the first statement presented as a fact. Person B will read the statement for the same biome. Talk to each other to determine which one is false. The partner with the false answer will put an X over that square. Continue reading and discussing each fact until you have crossed out half the facts as incorrect. The activity is a little like the board game Battleship. Notice this information gap is an alternative. In this case, Task A and Task B have different facts filled in. They each have half the facts. Students have blank spaces and must talk to their partners to fill in the blank spaces with each fact. Partner B has the other half of the information and will ask questions to fill in her chart and provide the answers that she has written in her chart. An additional version of an informational gap is one that has a visual component. Students have to be able to describe the correct atoms and listen to complete the information accurately. Partner B would have the opposite information and would supply the proton, neutrons, and electrons information for the missing information for partner A. Let's debrief this activity. How are information gaps effective for English learners? Which principles did it align with? How did it build speaking and listening skills? And finally, how could you further modify this activity for science content? Mental paragraphs are an activity developed by Zwires and Crawford that practices oral language, but also argumentation or comparative skills. Work with a partner. For the first round, decide who will be the speaker and who will be the listener. Pick a topic for which you both have background knowledge. For example, the Olympics, e-readers, standardized testing, or the role of technology. Now, the speaker is going to create a mental paragraph. The speaker may want to take notes on content, but can use the sentence stems listed above. The speaker will give pros and cons or advantages and disadvantages about the topic. The listener will clap each time he or she wants the speaker to change from pro to con or vice versa. This can be done every 1 to 3 sentences. Some of the useful phrases are one advantage of, one disadvantage of, on the other hand, however, or at the same time. After you have exhausted that selected topic, switch roles so that the speaker becomes a listener. An alternative is to have a second listener to record, take notes, or decide which way the speaker is actually leaning with his or her own opinion. And instead of clapping to switch pros and cons, you could also do this as a compare, contrast, or for and against. Let's debrief the questions as a class. How was this activity, the mental paragraphs, effective for English learners? Which principles of effective instruction did it align with? How did it build speaking and listening skills? How could you make this into a writing activity? And finally, how would you modify this activity for science content? To review, in this session, we have modeled and participated in a variety of strategies to boost English learners' language development, content knowledge, and confidence in participation, including the inside-outside circles, drawing concepts, using sentence stems, grouping, forming pairs by playing cards, dictogloss, the video observation guide, an information gap task, and mental paragraphs. Specifically, these strategies focus on listening and speaking. Do you know of others to share with your classmates? Now let's have some planning time. Choose a topic. Pick one of the strategies from today's session. Brainstorm an activity for the topic you chose. Be specific and make a model or graphic organizer if appropriate. Be prepared to share out and explain how it aligns with the principles of effective instruction for English learners. Consider the science content and standards that you will choose. As a wrap-up, we will do a fan and pick activity. You will each get a strip of paper with a different question. Think of your response to this question based on this class and all of the sessions focused on the instruction of linguistically diverse students. Take some quick notes on a sticky note. Move around the room and find a partner. First, one partner will read the question and then give an answer. The second partner will then read the question and give an answer that he has been assigned. After you have finished discussing, you switch cards. Now you go find a new partner and share again, but this time you have a new question, the question that your previous partner answered. You can say what your previous partner said and add on to it, or you can create your own answer. Review the sample Create Science lessons that have been posted online. In particular, review Table 1, Planning a Create Content Lesson. Use the model to create your own physical and earth and space science lessons by writing objectives, choosing texts, selecting vocabulary, planning activities, and emphasizing the language of the content. Did we meet our objectives today? As I read each content objective, snap if we met the objective. Did we determine language practices needed to participate in physical and earth and space science lessons? Did you distinguish between content and language objectives? Did you identify strategies to build the listening and speaking skills of linguistically diverse students? And did you plan a physical and earth and space science lesson that includes strategies to teach science to linguistically diverse students including objectives and assessment plans. Did we meet our objectives today? As I read each objective, snap if we met the objective. Did we orally share principles of effective instruction and describe how they may look in the classroom? Did we record language practices related to physical and earth and space science lessons in a graphic organizer? Did you write language objectives based on content objectives? Did you read a research brief on developing science lessons infused with language practices and write a plan using a template? As a ticket out, write 3 key ideas that you learned about in this session and one question that you still have.